Jesus left the house and sat on the beach. In no time at all, a crowd gathered along the shoreline, forcing him to get into a boat. Using the boat as a pulpit, he addressed his congregation, telling stories. "What do you make of this? A farmer planted seed. As he scattered the seed, some of it fell on the road, and birds ate it. Some fell in the gravel. It sprouted quickly, but it didn't put down roots, so when the sun came up, it withered just as quickly. Some fell in the weeds. As it came up, it was strangled by the weeds. Some fell on good earth and produced a harvest beyond the farmer's wildest dreams." Then Jesus said, "Are you listening to this? Really listening? Study this story of the farmer planting seed. When anyone hears news of the kingdom and doesn't take it in, it just remains on the surface, and so the evil one comes along and plucks it right out of that person's heart. This is the seed the farmer scatters on the road. The seed cast in the gravel. This is the person who hears and instantly responds with enthusiasm, but there is no soil of character, and so when the emotions wear off and some difficulty arrives, there's nothing to show for it. The seed cast in the weeds is the person who hears the kingdom news, but weeds of worry and illusions about getting more and wanting everything under the sun strangle what was heard, and nothing comes of it. The seed cast on good earth is the person who hears and takes in the news, and then produces a harvest beyond her wildest dreams." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I have loved gardening since I was a young mother-to-be in Arizona. The very day before I gave birth, might have something to do with it, I don't know, I was hauling bags of concrete to set posts for a garden fence. In Arizona, you have to get your plants in February if you want to harvest something before the summer's scorching heat comes and kills everything. Then, of course, in Vermont, the growing season was a lot shorter. The rule of thumb there was that you don't plant anything until Memorial Day, if you want to be sure that you won't get bit by the frost. The last few years in Vermont, I was gardening in a less than ideal garden plot. As it turned out, the place that was tilled up for my building's garden was tilled because the place was flat, not because it was particularly fertile. I even considered starting a blog that would reflect not only my particular plot, but how I felt my life was going as I recovered from a divorce. I was going to call this blog Gardening in Gravel. The plot, though it was flat, and though it was tilled, had only a thin layer of soil placed over a graveled area where school buses had previously turned around. I was forever pulling rocks of various sizes out of the dirt. But of course, old-time Vermonters said that gardening in rocks was all farmers ever did in Vermont, and they can testify to that. If you go to Vermont, you will see the old stone fences that made people such good neighbors in Vermont, and they got those stones, of course, out of their fields. So I would complain to my master gardener sister, and she always started out by saying, "Well, did you get a soil test?" I never did test the soil. I knew what was wrong. I just needed to get more organic material into that garden. I kept threatening to get a dump truck load of topsoil. But I know that there's more to soil tests than discovering that the soil is made out of dirt and gravel. Soil tests will tell you what you need to do to amend your soil so it will be more fertile. Is the soil clay? Is it sand? Is it acidic? Is it alkaline? I didn't get around to that. But I got some pretty good beans, and the kale grew even, I didn't want that much kale. And the deer wouldn't even eat it. Everything else, but not the kale. Now, when I was a girl, I lived on a sheep ranch, on very steep land near Bandon that was best meant for growing, of course, Doug fir. So Daddy would occasionally have to replenish the sparse grass that grew on those steep hills. He had cleared with his bulldozer, he had cleared a flat place, we called the flat, yes, so that a biplane could land there. And periodically he would hire that person to spread grass seed over our ranch. But then if he only needed to, say, replant a field, something less than 300 acres, he would use a hand crank seed spreader. It's not unlike, of course, the fertilizer spreaders that we have. I don't know if you can use the same piece of equipment or not. So he would walk up and down. He knew how far it would spread the seed, and he'd walk up and down, turning that handle, and this spreader would broadcast seed over a fairly wide area. So that's where today's parable becomes familiar to us. Because farmers in Jesus' day broadcast their seed over a field. They didn't have a machine to plant seed in nice, even rows. They just threw it out and hoped it would grow. Sometimes, I suppose, if they had enough money to own a mule, they would plow their fields, but that wasn't everybody by any means. Most of us have known this parable since we were children. It might be the first parable we were ever introduced to, and I'm sure somebody gave you seeds to have in your hand. And today at Falls City, I took the kids outside into the parking lot. I did have a microphone on, and the grown-ups could hear me inside. They just couldn't hear the kids, and said, next time, tell us what the kids said. But I wasn't sure that was going to happen. I just said, well, talk amongst yourselves. We're going out here. And we talked about what kind of land would be best if you were going to plant a seed. So it's a great parable for children. But it's a parable about parables, in a way. Jesus broadcast his teaching about as widely as anyone could who traveled by foot. And at first, very few people understood him. What's this story? At least of all, of course, his apostles. But Jesus used parables to stretch people's thinking, to give them some kind of unconsidered, surprising insight into what God's reign would look like and how we just might respond in a different way than we had considered before. Jesus used everyday images as metaphors and similes, and he invited people to think. What do you think? What do you make of this? He asked. Or, tell me what you think. And are you really listening? Or those who have ears, let them hear. Today's reading was split in two by the lectionary gremlins. There was a part in the middle that was left out, where there was a reference to ancient Hebrews and their lack of respect for the Word of God, often as broadcast by the prophets. Matthew's gospel liked to do that because it was written to Jewish populations, so to have the words of the prophets quoted just reminded them that Jesus had continuity with their lineage, continuity with the Jewish religion. So in today's reading, first we heard the parable, and then we heard Jesus' explanation to his followers who were saying, huh? The followers had listened to that short story about the seeds and probably said, yeah, so? And we might do the same thing, except that we already have Jesus' explanation. And when we hear this parable, we already know what the explanation is. Oh, that's what we're supposed to do with these stories. We're supposed to think about them and see how they might affect our lives. Now, although we might farm differently today, or not, some people still use those hand spreaders, we can still get something out of Jesus' stories and his agricultural metaphors and so forth. And Jesus continues to ask us, what do you make of this? Well, the word these days is certainly still broadcast far and wide. I'm not sure that I always like the way it's broadcast. A lot of radio and television programs are either not very imaginative, the ones that are about church. They don't get imaginative about Jesus' words. They take them quite literally. And sometimes that kind of narrows our understanding of the reign of God instead of broadening it. And then there are those preachers who are way too imaginative, and they preach the gospel of prosperity. You know, you follow God's rules, you're going to get rich. That is not what I heard in today's reading, by the way. But you know, people also listen to local broadcasts of what local preachers have to say, ordinary Methodist and Presbyterian preachers. You'd be surprised how many people listen to public access television, even in the middle of the night. I don't watch television, so I don't see that. But I've certainly had people come up to me in other places and say, oh, I saw you on TV. And it's like, what? Oh, that's right. And these people hear how everyday preachers interpret the scriptures in their town. And you know, sometimes people are moved to think for themselves. Now, we here in church, somewhere along the line, you and I probably heard the wonder of the word, to use a phrase from a hymn by Jan Ildesacker. We have at some time or another had God's word planted deep inside of us. So the question is, I think, Jesus asks us, well, what kind of soil are we? Have we had our inner soil tested lately? Let's revisit very briefly those various kinds of soil. The road or the path. Now, any of you who have seen a deer path or a sheep path know that because those animals travel the same way every time, nothing grows on those paths. Well, there are paths across parks that look just about the same, and that's not sheep. So the word lands there, this well-traveled, hardened part of the field or the field, and often people just don't notice. Maybe we have become hardened to anything that would make us feel vulnerable or more vulnerable than we already are. Might make us feel a little less in control of our own lives. It might sound not very reasonable, and after all, we're well-educated, well-thought, scientific people. You know, everything's explainable. There's no reason to give any credit to a God we can't see. The word, well, it's just so much debris. Let somebody else pick it up, or let the birds eat it. For some reason, we become hardened, and it no longer even thinks about taking root. Then there's the rocky soil. For a little while, it sounds hopeful. Yes, we might even tear up a little bit. We make resolutions. We plan to live more adventurously, more compassionately, more faithfully. But before long, our lives take a difficult turn, or our families and friends scoff at us, and we just sort of slough it off. It's like revival movements or grass fires, a mile wide and an inch deep. There are no deep roots to keep the plant alive when the excitement dries up. So that seed, well, it didn't really have much of a chance either. And then, well, we know about this one. We know about the weeds. There is a parody of the garden song called the Anti-Garden Song by Eric Kilburn. It sounds same tune as before. Slug by slug, weed by weed, my garden's got me really teed. In the first verse, the crabgrass grows, the ragweed thrives, the broccoli has long since died. The only thing still left alive are some radishes and beans. My carrot plants are dead and gone. Hear the rabbits sing a happy song. Until you've weeded all day long, you don't know what boredom means. So except for gardeners and some organic farmers who employ lots of idealistic, low-paid young people to hand weed, hey, I know some of those people. Most farmers spray their fields to keep the weeds down. But in Jesus' day, they didn't have Roundup. So if a field turned out to have lots of thorns and weeds in it, milkweed, whatever, dandelion, the farmer just wrote that field off. The barley or the wheat just wouldn't have much of a chance. Everything else grew so much faster. I have to admit that I think our own inner soil is most often like that field. And as far as I know, there is no spray that I can buy that will get rid of the anxiety with which I so often face life, or the sense that I can't keep control of my life, or the temptation to get more money and stuff, all in the vain hope that I'll be happy and, hey, maybe I'll never die. Those weeds crop up and show up and grow quite well everywhere and every day. Because, after all, it's the American dream, isn't it? Security becomes our idol. And the weeds that grow in our hearts so easily crowd out the good seed and the good intentions, the insights and the commitments that we've made in response to God's tantalizing word. But of course, those of us who come to church, we like to think when we hear this parable that, well, when we test our inner soil, we'd be like that fertile, well-prepared field that welcomes the seed and offers it the chance to root, nourishes it, so that our lives become fruitful beyond anything we'd ever thought of. We'd like to be that kind of soil. We'd like to be the kind of people that others look at and say, well, look at her. How does she do it? Or, look at him. He has such courage. So what do we do to become that soil? Well, I think we do try to prepare our hearts, whether we own a mule or not. Ouch. You remember Balaam's ass, right? Well, I'll preach on that one of these days. Now, that was a donkey that really had something to say. But we prepare our hearts. I don't know about plowing them, and then we listen for the word, and then we think about it. When we're thirsty for God, we can hang in there, and we can provide opportunities to get watered because, we have legs. When we're distracted, we can gently encourage our minds to turn back toward Jesus. We can pray for the courage to move beyond the fear and anxiety that choke out God's loving word. Yes, we have legs. We don't have roots. We can get up out of some of those other places and put ourselves into good soil. This is mixing the metaphors a little, but you get my drift. We've got a little more choice than that piece of corn. we can get out of the weeds and we can get into the good dirt. We can join the God who was not afraid to get his or her hands dirty in the work of creating us and growing us to flourish in this world. Amen.